Top 5 offenses. You go Chiefs, Buffalo, Chargers, Tampa Bay, and you have Cincinnati rounding out the top 5, correct?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. All right. Let's start with the Chiefs. Give me the profile of who the Chiefs were last year as an offensive team.
Up and down, but in the end, one of the best offenses in the NFL. I mean, I think it would, it's disingenuous to say, oh my gosh, why were people worrying about the Chiefs? We all watched the Chiefs, and there were games in there that were some of the worst of the Mahomes-Reed era. But guess what? The great quarterbacks, the great coaches, they have that ability to figure it out. And by the end of the year, they had it figured out, whether you're looking at it statistically, eye test, whatever. We all watched that Chiefs-Bills game. And then the next week, they have a disastrous game or disastrous second half against the Bengals. So there were some inconsistencies. The explosive plays were not as available to them as they were in previous years. But man, if you just look at it efficiency-wise, they were able to figure it out when you look at the larger sample. And so if you're giving me Mahomes, Reed, a top 5 offensive line, which I do believe they have, and I think they have enough weapons. It's not going to look the same as it did with Tyreek Hill, but man, it's still, I think it's still going to be pretty good.
Okay, you got the Bills second. Tell me about what they were like in their aggressiveness passing the football in the early downs and what your thoughts are as they move away from Brian Daboll, who's now the head coach, obviously with the Giants.
2 big questions with the Bills. One is some offensive line issues, the right side of their O-line. It feels like every Bills game the last 2 years when it hasn't gone well, they've had pass protection issues. But what you said is really what I'm focused in on here is that Brian Daboll threw the football more than any coach, any play caller in the NFL over the last 2 years. And that includes Andy Reid, which is really saying something because we've all watched Andy Reid. And so now you have a first-time offensive coordinator in Ken Dorsey, and you have a defensive-minded head coach in Sean McDermott. And so I believe that when you have Josh Allen and you have a run game that's mediocre and you have a pass game that's really good, you should be passing the football a lot, as much as Brian Daboll did. And so I have a little worry that McDermott might have a little more influence and say, hey, Ken, let's be a little bit more balanced. We don't always need to go for it. We can run the football more. And I know on the surface, you would say, well, what's wrong with that? I just think it's going to lead to less efficiency with them because I think they're going to be a pretty mediocre run game. And think I always like to put my shoes in like the defensive coordinator, myself in the defensive coordinator shoes, like when they're handing the ball off to Devin Singletary. I mean, if I'm a defensive coordinator, I'm clapping. That's great. The ball's out of Josh Allen's hands. I'm all for that. So I think you don't want to do that, even if defenses are kind of daring you to do that.
And this is probably how I should have introed the entire thing that we're doing here based on the pieces, is how you're ranking these. It isn't just, hey, here's Sheil's thoughts independent of every single metric out there. But what you're combining DVOA, you've got EPA in there. And then I also think some of the games lost on both sides of the football. So if you could just give us a quick template for how you're applying that to how you see the offenses and defenses that we'll get to.
Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to look at everything. What does the roster look like? What changes did they make in the offseason? What coaching changes did they make? What did the numbers say? And then there are these areas of regression where you say if a team was like the most injured offense in the NFL last year, chances are they're not going to be as hurt by injuries this year. And so you can look at it and say, if they get league average injury luck, league average, turnovers are part skill, part luck. You have a fumble and somebody falls on it and there's a randomness to it, or there's a deflected pass. So those are some of the things you can look at. So I'm just trying to get a whole picture of these teams going into 2022.
All right. So we got the Chiefs, Bills, number 3, go Chargers. I think you and I, our first dialogue ever was, hey, man, really like what you're doing. I, too, love the Chargers this year. And I think it's been maybe a 4-year tradition for you and I. I would look at the personnel and I go, man, if things can really click for the Chargers, I think this team could be awesome. We know the defensive concerns, but who are they on offense?
Yeah, if we do it for the next 10 years, I think one of the times we will be right. So let's just continue to stick with it. I mean, I feel like there's not even a lot we have to say about the Chargers. Our eyes watch Justin Herbert, and anyone who's watched football for, more than a year, you're just like, this guy is amazing. The ceiling is Hall of Fame, one of the best of all time. That ceiling is available to him with his skill set. And so last year, it wasn't necessarily always pushing the ball downfield. They were a little bit more methodical. They had some issues on the right side of their offensive line. This year, they draft a guard in the first round, so they fixed the right guard situation, you would think, and we'll see what happens at right tackle. But they've really rebuilt that offensive line pretty well over the last couple of years. And so I'm just looking at Herbert, the offensive line, Mike Williams, Keenan Allen, Austin Eckler. Eckler. Like, they were a top 5 offense last year. I think Herbert's going to win the MVP. He's my pick for MVP this year. I think he's going to put up crazy numbers, and I think they're going to win the AFC West. And so, like you said, I've been wrong before on the Chargers, so take it with a grain of salt. But man, I just, since like the second or third game Herbert watched, I'm just like, holy cow, this guy is special. And so one of these years, he's just going to have that completely ridiculous season, and I think it could be this year.
Tampa's pretty self-explanatory. So I do want to get to Cincinnati at number 5, because the story seems to be that they're not the story, that it's the depth of the AFC. It's all the different quarterbacks and the team that represented the AFC. And I get it too. It wasn't like Cincinnati was, week 1 to week 18, the team, and everybody knew about it. It's still kind of a surprising run, but I think the story is that they're not the story. And you seem to be kind of going against that.
Yeah, I usually like going with the nerds, like going with the numbers as much as possible. I'm not there with the Bengals. And so the case against them is pretty much what you laid out.
You're anti-nerds, you're pro-Bengals when it comes to Cincinnati.
When it comes to Cincinnati, normally I'm pro-nerd, and I would include myself in that group most of the time, as people can probably tell. But I just look at them and their issues last year. So I think the case against them is that, hey, they weren't great last year. They made the Super Bowl, but if you look at the advanced numbers, the offense was good. The offense wasn't great. They had kind of an easy schedule. And so there are some of these things that you look at and say, man, don't just go off them making the Super Bowl. But when you just look at it, their issues are very solvable to me. And one of them is Burrow was coming off a knee injury last year, and their offensive line wasn't good. And they were running the ball way too much for most of the season. And so they were taking the ball out of his hands. And so I think that led to their offense not being very good. And then the other one's obvious. We've seen their offensive line. I mean, they give up 9 sacks against the Titans, legitimately one of the bottom 3 offensive lines in the NFL. And then they went out and they signed 3, I would say, competent starters. There's no one who's an all-pro who you're going to say, wow, this guy, Chris Collinsworth is going to be drooling over this guy on Sunday Night Football. But they're 3 competent starters. And so if that offensive line goes from like 30th to, let's say, 17th, just picking a number out of nowhere, and all of a sudden they're saying, all right, Burrow looks good, we can throw the football more, he may be the most accurate quarterback in the NFL. I just feel like they're going to be able to make up for some of those issues that they had for a long time last year. So yeah, I'm in on the Bengals.
Yeah, no, you pointed it out, 51% passing on early downs. You're like, okay, with Burrow and the weapons, like, why would you do that? Because look, the one thing that I think is consistent with how you feel about any team, and this is something we talked about before, and it's very clear now, like, if you like your guy behind center, why are you wasting bullets by running the football?
100%. Well said. That was much better said than I said it. Yeah.
and that's really what the game has become. It hasn't just been you on this early down neutral setting stuff. It's just, if you have the personnel for it, why are you bailing the defense out by trying to be balanced? Like, what's the fucking point? And I think there's a lot of numbers that prove that this is the right way to go about it. It was very clear for much of the season, and maybe it's because of that O-line, maybe it's Burrow coming off the injury here. Cincinnati didn't trust that combination to throw it more because, as you said, 51%, but they did face the second easiest run of defenses on their schedule last year, which you also pointed on the piece.